This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome Jonathan Eig. Jonathan Eig is the best-selling author of 6 books. His most recent, King, A Life, was an instant New York Times bestseller, a Barack Obama summer 2023 read, and was hailed by the New York Times as the definitive account of Martin Luther King's life. He joins us on the Vickers Crossing.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. Welcome back. It's another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. Glad to have you back with us. This is season 9 of the Vickers Crossing and episode number 3. And my name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London, Ontario.
He does it well, too. He does it really well. My name is Kevin George. I serve as a priest in a church called St. Aidan's, northwest corner of London. I'm happy to be with you today.
All right. And we are looking forward to chatting to a gentleman that I've been looking forward to talking to. He wrote a really good, well, we're going to get into the book that he's going to do, but he wrote one we'll talk maybe a bit about later that I loved from a few years ago. But New York Times bestselling author and biographer Jonathan Eig is on hand today, Kevin.
Yeah, that's big. This is big.
So this is big. Yeah, definitely. Jonathan's most recent book is King, A Life. And of course, that's Martin Luther King Jr. that we're going to be reading about and talking about today. It has been hailed by the New York Times as a monumental new biography of Martin Luther King Jr. Jonathan is a graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Jonathan is a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal. His books have been published in more than a dozen languages. His first book, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, won a Casey Award for best baseball book of the year. And Ali, which is the one that
it's a great book
that I'm really kind of into. Yeah, Ali won the Penn and ESPN Award for literary sports writing, as well as other awards. Jonathan has appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and in 3 Ken Burns documentaries as well. And he has served as consulting producer on the 8-hour PBS Muhammad Ali documentary. And now he is going to add to his resume, like he needed any more on it.
Yes.
A little trip to the Vickers Crossing podcast today. So looking forward to getting Jonathan in here with us.
Rob, we need to check his webpage next week to see if it's been updated. His bio needs to be updated with and on the Vickers Crossing with Rob and Kevin.
Yeah, we'll see. He writes, I finally made it.
Yeah, a couple of Canadian fools. Anyway, important that we acknowledge that the lands upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. These are lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. And we work to find ways to make reparations, to restore relationships, and to acknowledge the ways each of us individually have participated in the brokenness of our relationships.
We've got some great sponsors here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And again, we want to send out our thanks and recognize A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And again, many thanks to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George today.
Yes, and of course, our thanks to the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, from Grand Bend to Port Rowan, that's easy for you to say, celebrate, worship, and serve together. And our thanks to Bishop Todd Townsend for that sponsorship.
And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And our thanks to Tricia Listar and her staff. It's always great to have you guys aboard with us as well.
They're a sparkling clean group, that crew.
They are. They're shiny.
Shiny.
Good, shiny, happy people.
They're good people.
Hey, as we record this, by the way,
Yep.
the Lions are taking on Green Bay
Tonight.
This is a big Thursday night game, Kevin.
Yep.
So, do you want to make another wager? Because right now I'm up one.
You're up one adult beverage. My prediction tonight, I'm going to go back to what I said at the opening game of the season, because I feel that Green Bay is not as strong. So I'm going to say Detroit will win this one 7+.
Okay. And I'm going to stay close again, because I think Green Bay's been playing well, and their quarterback Jordan Love looks pretty good.
He does look good.
Put up a few points. We got a good defense over in Detroit, but they'll put up a little bit. So I'll say Detroit by 3.
Okay, so
I'll keep that close.
Okay, and when Jonathan joins us, perhaps we need to ask, because I know he hails originally from Brooklyn. So we'll have to ask if it's Jets or Giants, I guess, right?
All right.
Because I mean, there must
do that. Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you're from Brooklyn area, you got to have
an affinity for one of them. So
yeah, I think
we'll ask.
find.
Yeah,
ask. It's a burning question. Inquiring minds want to know.
That's right. And Yankee cap or Mets cap?
Yeah, good questions.
Right? That's
good
another
questions.
One.
Good questions.
We'll get those out of the way first.
Those are good icebreakers when he gets in here. We can get to that.
That's right. Okay. All right. But we're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. as well, and this wonderful book. And Jonathan's going to join us coming up here. And Jonathan is now with us here at the Vickers Crossing podcast. Jonathan, what a great thrill to have you aboard. Kevin and I were chatting beforehand about some of the work we've enjoyed reading from you, and to have you on the podcast is a real thrill. So welcome. And how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah. All the way from London, Ontario in Canada. I mean,
that's right.
We said, on your bio, on your webpage, it talks about the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, Terry Gross, the Ken Burns documentaries, and now it's going to say, and guest on the Vickers Crossing.
I'll add that to the Wikipedia, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. No, we're thrilled you're here. We were just, before we were going on too, Kevin and I and we know you're a sports guy too, so we always kind of jibber jabber about sports on our podcast, and we're long-suffering Detroit Lions fans.
It's sad. It's
sad. We were saying, as we're recording this, the Lions are playing Green Bay tonight.
Yep.
So we had a little side bet going on with that. But you're originally from the Brooklyn area, are you not?
Yeah, I grew up in New York.
Yeah, in New York. So the question for us at the beginning was, is it a Yankee cap or a Mets cap? Is it a Jets jersey or a Giants jersey? Where do your allegiances lie?
I'm a Yankee fan because my dad was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and I was just trying to tick him off as much as possible. And I figured that was the best way to really make him mad.
So what about Giants or Jets?
Neither. I'm a child of the 70s, so I'm a Steeler fan.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, a Steeler fan. There you go.
Yeah.
Very good.
Another Midwest
Very
team,
good.
right? So
yeah, that's great
good stuff.
Well, that's good.
Well, look, we're really glad that you took time to be with us. And this book that you see behind me here, King, I took it with me on my summer vacation, and it's a doozy, because you can see here, for those of you watching this instead of listening, behind Jonathan, it's a nice heavy book, and I couldn't put it down. I mean, it was just and just like your previous work, it's just there's a real page turners and very enlightening. But before we get too far into it, let's start with the why of a biography of Martin Luther King, and why now. I mean, there have been many biographies, of course, of this great leader. We all know that. But tell us about why you felt the need to do this one now, and what makes this incredibly extensive book different than its predecessors.
Well, one of the things that I felt was that we'd turned King into a monument and a national holiday, and we'd lost sight of him as a man. Mm-hmm. We've even lost sight of him as a preacher, that we've forgotten that it was Reverend Dr. King. We call him Dr. King a lot. Yeah. And there's a cost to that. When you turn somebody into a monument, you lose sight of the fact that they were real, and I think you lose the potential for gaining real inspiration from them, because I could never be like that. I could never devote my life to something I feel passionate about in that same way. But when you see King as a man with flaws, with doubts, with who makes mistakes, then I think, we can embrace him in a different way. So that was one reason I wanted to write the book. Another reason is that I recognized that there were still people alive who knew him, and this might be the last chance to do a book with interviews with people who were close to him. And there were, dozens, scores of people around who I was able to interview before, as I got rolling with this project.
Yeah, well, actually, that takes me right into my next question, which was exactly that. You got to speak with some incredible people, many of whom were icons in their own right in terms of the civil rights movement. Some of whom are now no longer with us. I wonder if you can say more about that, about some of those folks you talked to, those encounters, and if there were some of them that really stood out, sort of above the others, because I know you really detail some of that in the book.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really interesting that I hadn't really thought about was that because they were so much older, they really didn't hold back. You
That's right.
know,
Yeah,
uh,
freedom.
they could say what they wanted, and they especially didn't have to worry about what Coretta might say.
Right.
And because that was always a concern for folks when she was around, they didn't want to offend her by saying anything that might be seen as controversial, or even not being critical, but just being honest about King's flaws. Like Harry Belafonte told me that King had been in love with a white woman when he was in seminary, and that he never got over it. That he talked about it for the rest of his life. Like, what would have happened if I'd married Betty? Um, and I don't think Belafonte necessarily would have been comfortable talking about that earlier. But the other thing is that as folks get older, they're able to reflect in different ways, and they're not caught up in the politics of it. So, people talked about what it was just like to be in the car with him.
Yeah.
What made him laugh, uh, how he felt when people began to lose confidence in him. When his popularity began to fall, and yet he was taking unpopular positions, not just against the Vietnam War, but speaking out against things like poverty and attacking racism in the North, where most of his supporters and most of his financing came from. So I think it was very interesting just to get the perspective of people who knew him well, to see how that really affected him. He had feelings. It hurt. He was a man who suffered for his beliefs, and that was really moving for me.
Yeah. Wow.
As you mentioned, he was a reverend. Like you say, we tend to see him only through the eyes or through the lens of the civil rights movement, as we should. But he was a pastor who led a church, right? That was part of his life as well. And I wanted to read a little bit from the book for our listeners. You write in the book that journalists, historians, and biographers would speculate about what made King special, about what gave him the courage and the vision to lead. And some observers have stressed the competitive nature of King's relationships with his father. Others focused on cultural factors, noting the guilt he felt about his middle-class upbringing, pointing out that he arrived in Montgomery when liberation battles were erupting in Africa and Asia, and when radio and television made it possible for a brilliant young preacher to be seen and heard in millions of homes. But the Reverend James Lawson, one of King's contemporaries, had argued that those interpretations miss an obvious and powerful explanation, that of King's calling from God. That was my case. That was King's case, Lawson said. It's not boasting. It's the deep down inside awareness that connects your life up with the life force of the universe, the God who created the heavens and the earth, to quote the Hebrew poets. So anyone who has that kind of calling, that something so profoundly alters their way of thinking and their behavior. And King had an understanding that in that as well, that Christian social action and suffering, martyrdom were connected. And you reference one of his most personal sermons in the book, where King recounts praying out loud out of concern for his family. I wonder if you could share a bit about that story with our listeners, and perhaps say more about what you learned about what really motivated Dr. King.
I think it's really at the core of who he was as a person, as an activist. And it's funny because I often answer that, the number one influence, I think, in his life and career was Jesus. And I'm a Jew, and I'm also, a white guy living in the North. And when I say this, a lot of the Southern preachers who I'm talking to are, one of them said, "Thank you."
Hey, amen.
Coming from a Jewish journalist who's,
from the North. This is fantastic.
Who has no, horse in this race.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
But it's just it just seems objectively, accurate to me, and somewhat obvious. But as I said, a lot of historians, a lot of journalists managed to overlook that through the years, because journalists tends to see themselves as skeptics and often as agnostics, or King, everything about him is rooted in the fact that he comes from the South, and he comes from a culture in which church means fighting for justice. The Black social gospel means that if you believe in saving souls, but you also believe in reforming society so that it matches what the Bible tells us we're supposed to be. It's not just about individuals, and that's just ingrained in King's DNA, and it's ingrained in his father's and his grandfather's DNA. And King is just the first one in that line of preachers who has the power, has the opportunity to take that fight nationally, to take it out of the communities and the churches in which they're preaching. But in part because of the things I mentioned there, his television and other things, he's able to take this message, the same message, and make people all over the world hear it.
It really amplifies it, like in a way it gives him that first, but it is incredible. I think that you're right. His biggest influence is Jesus. Yeah, obvious, but there.
Yeah. And another great influence that I was appreciative of reading about more in the book, Jonathan, was his wife, Coretta. And you're right about that, an amazing woman in her own right. Your book sheds great light on her as a powerful witness and a very strong woman. It couldn't have been easy worrying about, her own safety, the safety of her family in those times. And in the book, you write that after the bombing of their home, Coretta told her sister that her faith became more real. And again, I'd like to read a little excerpt from the book. You write that her prayers took on more meaning. Lord, I've done all that I can do, believing that we are right. And now I leave it up to you, was her prayer. She expressed no fear of death. If I die, she said, and if my husband should die for his cause in trying to bring about God's kingdom on earth, then what a noble way to die. Coretta seemed to have realized that Martin, for all his strength and courage, remained a passionate person who needed support and love perhaps more now than ever. And he functioned better with a wife and children, she said, because he needed the warmth we gave him. But Coretta gave him more than warmth. He had been attracted from the beginning by her intellect, her inclination to activism. Daddy King may have wanted ML to move back home, and Obi Scott may have wanted to take Coretta and Yoki back to Marion, but Martin never considered leaving or sending Coretta out of harm's way. As Martin Luther King Jr. found his life moving in new and unexpected directions, into leadership of a burgeoning protest movement, and into heightened danger, he relied more than ever on his wife. Can you share maybe a little bit more today, Jonathan, about this incredible woman, her contributions, not just for her husband, but of course for the civil rights movement as well?
I think she had to really understand sacrifice, and certainly Martin Luther King understood sacrifice too. But Coretta had to do everything she was doing and to take the same risks that her husband was taking, knowing that she was getting very little of the credit for it, and that her husband wasn't always treating her with as much respect as she deserved, and she still had to swallow her pride and stand behind him. And I think King was really attracted to her because she was an activist, because at that point when they met, she had more experience as an activist than he did. She'd gone to Antioch and had been involved in all kinds of protests there, and King hadn't done anything yet at the time of their meeting. So I think that's a big part of what he admires and values in her and loves about her. And yet he is still so stuck in his old-fashioned sexist ways that he doesn't see her value as an activist sometimes, and doesn't want her to be involved in the movement, not because he's worried about her safety, but because he feels like the woman's role is to stay home and raise the kids. And that hampered King. It hampered him from recognizing the contributions of other women as well, who might have been, really excellent leaders. And King wasn't open-minded to their potential. So it's one of the great ironies that he married this incredibly strong woman who really helped shape his activist career, and yet he didn't fully appreciate her contributions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I was really taken by that too. And again, there's that bit about the honesty about his life, right? His own failings or his own downsides or whatever, that you really portray that clearly. I think the other thing with her too is, since his death, is just the way she comported herself in the decades after is really quite remarkable. I mean, I think she became a bit of an icon herself.
No question about that. And she's largely responsible for the fact that we have a national holiday in his honor and a monument in Washington, D.C. She really took it upon herself to make sure that, his legacy would continue.
Yeah. You, one of the things that you had access to in this that previous biographers did not, I guess, was the FBI files and tapes that were released not so long ago now. In reading the book, I was taken by just how very much paranoia existed in America about communism during his day. I mean, it was talk about a fixation, holy moly, to the point where there were people who believed that you're right, the fluoridation of the water was a plot, and it's in that sort of an environment where it made it very easy to scheme and to undermine democracy. And when I read that, I thought about where we're at today, to be honest, with the fact that with social media, people will believe just about anything and the conspiracy theories that are out there. But I wonder if you can say more about the FBI's obsession with Martin Luther King and particularly his close confidants that he had around him, and with the civil rights movement in general. And what did you find most surprising, I guess, in all of that material that you had new access to?
Well, I think the real problem arises when you get that paranoia over communism, and then you stir in racism, and that concoction of those two ingredients really proves to be particularly toxic. And the FBI initially takes interest in King because he is surrounded by some people who have former communist ties, and maybe even some who still have some connection to the Communist Party. And because of the paranoia, because of J. Edgar Hoover's obsession, they get authorization from Robert F. Kennedy to begin wiretapping the phones of King and some of his associates. And it becomes clear pretty quickly from listening to their phone calls that King is not interested in communism, that there's no communist activity going on here. So why don't they call off the wiretaps? That's where the racism comes in.
Yeah.
Right.
Because once they start listening, they realize that we don't, this guy poses a different kind of threat. It's not communism. It's about the white power structure and the status quo, and he threatens that. And they hear him on the phone talking to women other than Coretta, and clearly, flirting with them, and clearly seems to have relationships with them. And that becomes the weapon that they use to try to take him down and to make sure that he doesn't get too powerful. And J. Edgar Hoover's pretty transparent about it. He says at one point that, King poses the greatest threat to America as we know it, because he might unite the people in fighting for change.
Yeah.
Right.
So the change that he's fighting for, I think most people would agree, was a positive change. It was inclusion. Yes. He wasn't trying to take down America. He was trying to join it. He was trying to make sure that it was more democratic. But if you're in power, you might see that as a threat to your hold on power. And I think that's exactly what J. Edgar Hoover diagnosed.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing as I was reading it, because of course there seems to be this fascination that Hoover has with Martin Luther King and his sex life and et cetera, which I just found very ironic and rich. I just thought, Hoover? I mean,
Yeah, right.
It's just like, wow. Anyway, Martin Luther King had a couple of times, and you described these in the book, where he was hospitalized or stayed at home for what was then called exhaustion. But you rightly point out in the book that he probably most likely struggled with depression. You write about the influence that writers like Paul Tillich had on King, a great theologian. You write that King learned lasting theological lessons from people like Tillich and Wyman. And in his seminal work, The Courage to Be, Tillich wrote that the courage to be requires acceptance of anxiety, the anxiety that comes with guilt, condemnation, and death. That courage means staying connected to God when one loses faith. But doubt is not the opposite of faith, Tillich wrote. It is one element of faith. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Martin Luther King's sort of own dark night of the soul, his own sort of, because again, I think that's the other thing that makes this book so special, is it paints a very real picture of a pastor. Yeah. A pastor who's trying to pastor a church, lead a movement, do all this stuff, manage his personal life, and it's overwhelming. And I just found that very compelling part of this book. I wonder if you can say more about his own struggles there.
It starts early. Even as a teenager, he twice attempted suicide. And some people would say they were sort of half-hearted attempts. He jumped from a second-story window of his home
Mhm.
But it just goes to show how sensitive and how vulnerable he felt. And I think that it's something that continues. And it must have been very hard for him to have these kinds of doubts, not just his doubts about faith, but his doubts about his own um, performance as a human being, whether he was living up to the words that he preached, and whether he was, failing the people he loved. All of that, he clearly wrestled with it, and you can see how it comes out sort of in this filtered way through his sermons, because he talks about um, doubts. He talks about moral failures. He often talks about schizophrenia of the soul, feeling like there are two of us, warring within each of us, and he's doing it from the pulpit in a way that is not necessarily in the first person, but it's clear that these are things that are obsessing him. And I don't know that he ever had anyone he could talk to about that. It's not clear to me whether Coretta or anyone else was a confidant that he could really talk to about his own failings. But by the end of his life, the last few years, a lot of his friends were really concerned about his emotional and psychological health, and they were urging him to take some time off or to even consider medication. They were deeply worried about him, and he felt like he couldn't take time off because his work was too important. He felt like he couldn't see a psychiatrist or a psychologist because the FBI might find out about it and use that against him too. And that's just really heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. You point out if there were a few things that angered King, but nothing more than racism in the church, right? And if we go back a little bit and remember our history, April of '63, the Birmingham campaign started with coordinated marches and sit-ins against racial segregation. April 10th, a circus judge issues an injunction against parading, common demonstrating, boycotting, trespassing. And then April 12th, which was Good Friday, King gets arrested. And while he's in jail, he reads a newspaper called A Call for Unity, a statement by 8 white Alabama clergymen against what King and his fellow protesters were trying to accomplish. And perhaps more than any other piece of writing, his letter from Birmingham jail would become his most lasting and passionate writing. And among the many great things that he wrote in the letters were these words: "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." And he wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block is not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice." And in the book, you described King's letter from jail as a love letter in the broadest sense. I wonder if you could say more about that, Jonathan, that idea of that it's a love letter.
I think you hit on a really good point. King, nothing seemed to aggravate him more than members of the church who wouldn't step up for what they professed to believe. And this goes back early in his career, and even the early days of the Birmingham campaign, when he arrives in town and one of the leading preachers, black preachers, doesn't meet him at the airport as promised, and suggests that maybe the support there is wishy-washy. And white northern preachers who would ask him to come and speak at their churches and at their synagogues, but who wouldn't speak out against the white flight that they were seeing in their communities. I think he felt like this was disappointing because these were people who professed love of the Bible and respect for God in the first place, and how could they not follow up with that? How could they not extend that to life on earth in our times? And I think I call it a love letter because we're talking about Christian love. King means something much deeper than just a love letter in the traditional sense. He's saying that we must all love each other and we must love our enemies. He doesn't have to. He often says, "I don't have to like Bull Connor, but I love him, and by showing him my love, I hope that he will appreciate where we're coming from and see that we can heal." that we can unite. And that's the message. And again, he always said he was a preacher. He didn't see himself as a protest leader. He didn't see himself as a political activist. Certainly didn't see himself as a politician.
No.
He was a preacher. He was trying to preach the gospel, and that meant sometimes he had to preach to other preachers who he didn't think were listening.
It was such a powerful image too of him getting that newspaper and reading that call to unity, and then over the days scrawling out his epistle in the margins, and I think he said it came out via his lawyer or somebody like that brought it.
Right, he was smuggling it out on sandwich wrappers and toilet paper, and then finally they got him some paper.
Yeah,
So
it's amazing. It is amazing. So many things we could talk about because the book is incredible, and I certainly recommend it to everyone's reading. My last question really is around one of the big takeaways from the book. You referenced this in the beginning, was just how real of a human being Martin Luther King was. And for those of us like me and Rob, like this podcast we do is a sort of a talk about the intersection of faith in the public square. We're just two guys, and we happen to be pastors. And sometimes, and we're just a couple little specks, but someone like Martin Luther King has been so blown up. Your incredible biography of him really gives us all of the gift of seeing the beloved child of God that I believe he was. And over the years, there's been much made about his failings. In fact, many have done a lot to sort of just quietly push that over there and not say much about it or ignore those things or downplay them. But you, on the other hand, have given us a really unvarnished account of this man's incredibly complicated, powerful, inspiring, and I would say even troubling life. And you've made the case that teaching his life in America today often means smoothing or polishing who he was and what his lessons were beyond recognition. And those words really struck me. I thought, wow, that is something. So in short, you say, in hallowing King, we have hollowed him. And I think that's a really profound observation. I wonder if, to conclude, then, if you can say more about the very simplified celebration, how that very simplified celebration of King comes at a cost to all of us. And I think given our need today for radical change, which is really what this man was about, particularly in our polarized time, more than ever, we need that unvarnished look, because the cost of not seeing those words for the weight that they were is really high, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a couple levels to this. One level is that we choose the comfortable parts of King's message. We talk about I have a dream and judging people by the content of their character, and we forget that he called for reparations and addressed police brutality and talked and in the same speech.
Yes,
that's in the I have a dream speech too, but we don't teach that part. And so there's a real danger there that we simplify and we take the stuff that is most palatable to us. And Harry Belafonte made that point to me. He said our schools are going out of their way not to teach about radicalism, even though this country was founded in the radical belief of independence. And until we get over that, we are going to just keep dumbing down King's lessons. The other reason that it's important to address King in all his complexity is that when we see him as human, we can begin to think about being more like him. But when we see him as a saint, when we see him as a superhero, then we can't even hope to aspire to that. We can't even think about sacrificing or fighting for our beliefs, because if you have to be perfect to lead, then we're never going to have any leaders. So I think it's really important. And I've been really pleased. I was nervous when I wrote this book. I was nervous when people might say, leave King alone, leave him the way he is. We like the unblemished version. But the reaction has been beautiful. People have been saying to me over and over again that they can relate to him better when they see his flaws, and they find him more heroic because they know that he had to overcome doubts and frustrations and failures. And that's we're all human, and I think it's important to see our heroes as humans.
Yeah, it's a lot, not easier, but it's more comfortable to walk alongside someone you admire when you can see their humanness and connect it to your own, and not just put them up on a pedestal and say, there's no way I could ever aspire to that.
Right.
But I could walk along that same level with that person. So that's what I appreciated so much about what you did here. Really good. So King A Life is the book. And Jonathan Eige has been our guest today. Jonathan, we really do appreciate you giving up your time for us today. It's always great
pleasure
to be able to chat. Yeah, that's great. We wish you all the best with this, and hopefully maybe something coming down the road from you.
I have a
Thank you.
question.
Who knows?
Yes.
Who knows?
I have a question. What's the next 500-page book?
I'm not telling yet. I have some ideas.
Okay.
But I'm not telling yet.
Okay, so he's not going to break. He's not going to break that on the Vickers Crossing.
No.
Stay
I wouldn't
tuned.
expect. Okay, stay tuned. We will definitely be watching. So, Jonathan, all the best to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And again, our thanks to Jonathan for taking time today, and really do commend the book to everybody. King is available now, so please look for it, pick it up, and enjoy.
What a great book. What a great guy.
Yeah, great conversation today. So, all right, buddy, that's another one in the books for us, and another book to talk about, I'm sure, down the road, maybe next week. So we'll be getting back together again. Again, thanks to our sponsors, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. To the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Thank you, Mr. Vicar 1.
Thank you, Vicar 2. I thought you were 1 and I was 2. Weren't you thing 1?
Flip it around. We
thing
can
1.
flip it around. Yeah.
Thing 1 and thing 2 is what we are.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Until we get together again next time, we'll look forward to having you with us. And Kevin, remember, my friend, when you go out of the house today or out of the office, wherever you are, remember to always look both ways
before you cross that street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!